Hey, this is Lincoln with In the Band. In this video, we're going to be covering the topic of orchestration in music and learning how to layer various tracks in BandLab. This video is part of a series about the basic tools of music theory and how to use these tools in composition or songwriting. If you're not already familiar with how rhythm, melody, and chords work, this video will make a lot more sense if you watch our videos on those topics before watching this one. Orchestration, or instrumentation, is the process of figuring out what each individual instrument or track needs to do in a particular piece of music and working out how those various parts fit together. Ideally, the elements of a song, melody, chords, and rhythm should all work together to create a cohesive piece of music, and there are a couple of really good guidelines to help make that happen. Let's talk first about putting melody and chords together. As you can probably figure out, the melody and the chords should be in the same key. Beyond that, it generally sounds the strongest or most natural when you have at least one of the same notes in both the melody and the chord for each chord in the chord progression. I'll show you what I mean. So let's say I'm trying to build a melody over a C major chord. Remember, C major contains the notes C, E, and G. Let's hear what happens if I try and build that melody using the notes D and F, notes found within the key of C major but not found within the C major chord. Can you hear how it sounds like that just doesn't quite work? The notes found within a chord are called chord tones, while the notes not found within a chord are called non-chord tones. Let's now try to build a melody over the C major chord using the notes G and E, both of which are chord tones. I think that's working a little better now. Remember, chord tones are in reference to whatever chord is being used at that moment. So the notes D and F, which were the non-chord tones we used over C major, are chord tones over certain other chords like D minor. Making sure the tracks in your song line up rhythmically is very important too. The grid in BandLab, which we talked about in our video on rhythm, is super helpful for this. The simplest way to line your tracks up rhythmically is just to keep everything playing on the same beats. So let's start by just laying down a basic pop beat with the drums. I'm going to grab the dry drum kit, and then like usual I'm going to turn on input quantize, the metronome. I'm going to set the tempo just a little bit slower to 90 BPM for this example, and then let's also set our key to C major. Now I'm recording 4 bars of the basic pop beat. You can also just record 1 bar and then loop it. The next thing I'm going to do is lay down chords. So I'm going to add another MIDI instruments track. I'm going to select grand piano, and then I'm going to play the 1-5-6-4 progression in the key of C major. But this time, instead of playing 1 whole note per measure, I'm going to play 4 quarter notes per measure. For my melody, I'm going to add another MIDI instruments track, and this time I'm going to go with the City Keys synthesizer. Because we're trying to keep everything perfectly lined up right now, I'm going to make a melody that stays within the key, uses mostly chord tones, and plays on every quarter note. Another important factor in putting a song together is the bass line. A bass line is pretty much a low melody, usually played by a bass guitar, synth bass, or upright bass, that kind of serves to tie the melody, chords, and rhythm together. Here's a general guideline for a simple bass line. The bass rhythm should line up with the kick drum, and the bass melody should line up with the root note of each chord in the chord progression. So let's add another MIDI instrument track for bass, and following those guidelines, we're going to have a bass line that plays the root note of each chord on beats 1 and 3 of every measure. These first examples we've been looking at are pretty much the most basic methods of lining up your tracks, but starting out simple can be a good thing, especially because it leaves a lot of room to add more later on. More complicated is not always better, but it's also not necessarily a bad thing. It really just depends on what kind of music you want to make. With that in mind, let's look at some ways we can change these simple frameworks to be maybe a little more exciting. Okay, so just like we did in our first video on rhythm, let's start by just sprucing up that basic pop beat a little bit by adding a hi-hat. And I'm just going to make a little 1-bar pattern here and then copy and paste it so it repeats for 4 bars. Now why don't we add another kick too in between beats 2 and 3 of every measure to make our kick pattern a little more interesting. Now, because we generally want our kick drum and our bass to align rhythmically, let's adjust our bass so it lines up with our new kick drum pattern. A great way to give a bass line a little more life is to add some fifths in there. So instead of just playing the root note of the chord it's playing with, your bass can alternate between the root and the fifth of that chord. You can do this using different patterns. So over our second chord, G, let's play the root twice and then move down to the fifth, which is D. And then over our third chord, A minor, let's play the root, A, then go down to the fifth, E, and then back up to the root. Another way to add variety to a bass line or other melody is just to change the octave of the note. So on our last chord, F, let's just move that second bass note up an octave to the next highest F. And then just to see how it sounds, I'm going to have that high F go down to an E at the very end there. Let's give that a listen. Another thing you can do is change the way a part fits in rhythmically just by dragging it backwards or forwards in time. I'm going to take my piano chords, which are currently playing on every quarter note, and just drag them half a beat to the right, so they're now playing on the off beat, or the eighth note in between every quarter note. At the end of the day, if it sounds good to you, that's the most important thing. It's generally a good idea to keep all of your tracks lined up on the grid for easy reference and editing, but again, these are just guidelines. You can orchestrate your song and line up your tracks however you want. That's all for now. Thanks for watching.